A civilization built the world's first planned cities, then walked away from them forever. The great urban centers of the Indus Valley, with their grid-patterned streets and advanced water systems, fell into an echoing silence over 4,000 years ago. This society left no grand monuments to kings or clear chronicles of its own history, only a profound and puzzling absence. Yet its story holds one of history's most remarkable secrets. By the end of our journey, you will understand how a culture can vanish from sight while its heart continues to beat for millennia. We will sift through clues of shifting rivers and ancient climate data, searching for what caused these thriving cities to empty. Then we will trace a hidden river of tradition, following symbols and practices that surfaced centuries later, woven deeply into the fabric of South Asian life. What does it truly mean for a civilization to end? The sheer scale of their ambition is still visible in the dust. Across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, more than 1,000 settlements formed the backbone of this society, but a handful of their cities stand as true marvels of the ancient world. Take Mohenjo-Daro, the so-called Mound of the Dead. Its streets were laid out in a near-perfect grid, a blueprint of order so precise it feels almost modern. Every main avenue was wide enough for 2 carts to pass, with smaller lanes branching off to rows of uniform, baked brick houses. This was not haphazard growth. This was a master plan, executed with a consistency that speaks of powerful, shared ideals. Walk those streets in your mind, and you would see not just houses, but a city built for community. There was a great public bath, a large rectangular pool lined with waterproof brick, likely a center for both ritual and social gathering. Nearby stood a massive granary, raised on platforms to store the harvest that fed thousands. This was a civilization that thought ahead, that engineered solutions for water supply, waste removal, and collective welfare on a scale unmatched in its time. But the story is not confined to 1 or 2 famous sites. Far to the south, on an island in the salt marshes of Gujarat, the city of Dhalavera rose with equal ingenuity. Here they built intricate water conservation systems, channeling every monsoon rain into a series of reservoirs carved into the rock. Theirs was a dialogue with a challenging environment, and they mastered it. Meanwhile, at Lothal, near the coast, archaeologists uncovered a vast brick-lined dockyard. This was a port city, a hub in a network that stretched across oceans. From here, beads of carnelian, bundles of cotton cloth, and prized timber sailed westward, reaching the great cities of Mesopotamia. Cuneiform tablets from far away mention a land called Meluha, a place of exotic goods, and scholars believe this was their name for the Indus realm. So picture this not as an isolated culture, but as a connected, thriving participant in the Bronze Age world, trading, planning, and building with a confidence that suggests centuries of stability. This is what makes the silence that follows so deafening. We are looking at a society that achieved a rare balance, one of remarkable urban sophistication without the glaring symbols of concentrated royal power. No towering pyramids for a single pharaoh, no vast palaces dripping with looted gold. Their grandeur was in the ordered street, the reliable well, the communal bath. They built for the many, not just the few. This very stability sets the stage for our central mystery. When a civilization is this well organized, this deeply rooted, what force could possibly cause it to walk away from its greatest creations? To understand what was lost, we must first appreciate just how much they had built, and how that very foundation may have carried something essential forward, even as the cities themselves were left to the wind. Yet their greatest strength may have also been their most profound vulnerability. A civilization built on rivers is a civilization built on a promise, one that the landscape does not always keep. The Indus and its sister waterways were not just features on a map, they were the living, pulsing foundation of everything. Their annual floods deposited rich silt, creating the agricultural surplus that fed those grid-patterned cities and allowed trade to flourish. But rivers, especially in this part of the world, are restless entities. Geological clues tell a story of monumental change. Researchers studying satellite imagery and sediment cores have pieced together evidence of a vast, now vanished river system once known as the Gaga Hakra. This was likely a mighty, perennial stream during the civilization's peak, threading through hundreds of settlements. Then, the clues suggest it began to falter. Tectonic shifts, the slow, grinding movement of the earth itself, may have gradually stolen its water, diverting tributaries to other courses. Or perhaps the river simply choked on its own silt, its bed rising until the water spilled out to find a new, lower path. The result was the same. A once reliable source of life became unpredictable, then scarce. Imagine the slow-motion crisis this would trigger. A farmer plants seeds in fields that have been fertile for generations, counting on the seasonal flood. The water does not come, or it arrives as a destructive torrent in the wrong place. The harvest fails. It fails again the next year. In a society where the entire urban economy rested on a steady, massive grain supply, this was not merely a hardship, it was an existential threat. The great granaries at Mohenjo-Daro would slowly empty. The intricate trade networks, which depended on agricultural surplus to produce goods for exchange, would begin to fray. This environmental stress did not cause a sudden, single catastrophe. It was a creeping pressure, a tightening constraint that would have forced communities to make impossible choices over decades, perhaps even centuries. The response was likely a gradual, painful migration, a dispersal of people away from the dying rivers and the magnificent cities those rivers could no longer support. Here lies our first major clue in the mystery of the urban collapse. The very foundation upon which they built their world of order and brick literally shifted beneath their feet. But if a changing river was enough to empty a city, was it enough to erase an entire culture's way of thinking? Or did that culture simply find a new vessel in which to travel? But a river does not change in isolation. It is part of a much larger conversation between earth and sky, one that scientists have learned to overhear by reading the most unlikely of archives. Deep within caves, water drips from the ceiling, each drop leaving behind a microscopic trace of the world above. Over centuries, these traces build into stone pillars called stalagmites, and locked within their layered rings is a chemical record of ancient rainfall. Far out at sea, cores of sediment pulled from the ocean floor hold pollen and dust that blew off the continent thousands of years ago. This is the science of paleoclimatology, the art of listening to the planet's past weather. And what these natural record keepers tell us about the Indus Valley's later centuries is profound. The data points to a major climatic shift beginning around 4,200 years ago. The Great Monsoon system, the lifeblood of the entire region, began to weaken. Its reliable rhythms faltered. Think of the monsoon not as a single storm, but as a vast, seasonal engine that pumps moisture from the ocean over the land. For generations, that engine ran with dependable power, filling rivers and soaking fields. Then, the evidence suggests it grew inconsistent. The result was not a simple, gradual drying. It was a period of punishing instability. Decades of prolonged drought would parch the land, stressing crops and draining reservoirs. Then, when the rains did return, they could arrive with violent intensity, delivering catastrophic floods that would wash away topsoil and overwhelm the very water management systems the cities were famous for. This was a 1-2 punch of environmental stress that would challenge any society. For the Indus cities, whose entire existence was a delicate balance of precise water control and agricultural timing, it could have been devastating. A single failed harvest could be managed. A series of unpredictable, climate-driven crises, however, would have stretched their remarkable social organization to a breaking point. The granaries, once symbols of abundance, would become focal points of scarcity. The shared trust that held such planned communities together would face unprecedented strain. This climatic downturn presents our second major clue. It was a large-scale, regional pressure that turned the challenge of a shifting river into a continent-wide emergency. It suggests that the people were not abandoning their cities on a whim, but responding to a changing world that made their urban way of life, at least in those specific locations, untenable. Yet even this compelling environmental explanation leads to another, deeper question. When people are forced to leave their homes, what do they take with them? Do they only pack their belongings, or do they carry something less tangible, a blueprint for living that can be rebuilt under a different sky? The cities were not sacked or burned. This is a silence that speaks volumes. In the final layers of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, archaeologists do not find the grim markers common to the fall of other ancient cities. There are no heaps of weapons, no hastily built defensive walls thrown up in a final, desperate stand. No mass resting places point to a single, violent event. The evidence, or rather the profound lack of it, paints a very different picture. Compare this to the near-contemporary collapse of cities in ancient Mesopotamia or Anatolia, where the archaeological record is often brutally clear. Layers of ash, shattered fortifications, and arrowheads embedded in walls tell a story of conquest and fire. For the Indus, that story is absent. What we see instead is a slow fading. Buildings show signs of repair, then poorer quality repair, and finally, abandonment. The meticulous brickwork of the Great Bath gives way to haphazard constructions crammed into once orderly streets. It is the archaeology of dwindling resources and fading central authority, not of a sudden, crashing blow from outside. This presents our third major clue. The end of the urban phase appears to have been a process of gradual exhaustion, a societal unraveling from within. The environmental pressures of shifting rivers and a fickle climate likely triggered a long, slow crisis, a crisis of faith in the system itself. When the granaries could not be filled and the trade goods stopped flowing, the social contract that held these planned cities together may have simply dissolved. People did not vanish. They likely made a rational, if heartbreaking, choice. They voted with their feet, dispersing into smaller, more flexible communities in the countryside, places where they could rely on local wells and smaller plots of land, free from the brittle complexity of the metropolis. This peaceful departure challenges older, dramatic narratives of Aryan invasions sweeping in to destroy a mighty civilization. That theory, once popular, has crumbled under the weight of this quiet archaeological testimony. The cities were not murdered. They were, it seems, gently left behind. But if the people walked away peacefully, what did they carry in their minds and in their traditions as they merged into the vast landscapes of South Asia? A civilization is more than its bricks and streets. It is a shared language of symbols. At the height of their urban life, the Indus people spoke this language with remarkable clarity. Across the vast expanse of their territory, from the coast to the foothills, they used a uniform system of weights. Exquisitely carved cubes of chert in precise decimal multiples have been found in every major city. A merchant in Lothal and a trader in Harappa could conduct business with absolute confidence using the same standard. This speaks of a powerful economic cohesion, a network of trust that spanned hundreds of miles. Then there are the seals, small stone tablets carved with beautiful, intricate animals and a script of mysterious symbols. These were likely used to stamp bales of goods, a mark of origin or ownership that traveled along trade routes. The script itself remains undeciphered, a silent code etched in soapstone and terracotta. But its very presence and its consistency is a testament to a complex society that needed to record, communicate, and administer. For centuries, these symbols were produced with care, a visual thread tying the civilization together. Then, in the archaeological layers that correspond with the city's later days, something telling happens. The script begins to fade from the record. Fewer and fewer seals are produced, and those that are found show a decline in craftsmanship. The elegant, standardized symbols give way to cruder, less uniform markings. At the same time, the remarkable consistency in pottery styles, in bead making, in the very artifacts of daily life, begins to break down. Where once you could find nearly identical clay pots in cities 500 miles apart, now regional variations become more pronounced. This is our fourth and perhaps most poignant clue. It is evidence of a slow systems failure, the long-distance trade that required standardized weights and official seals contracted. The administrative control, or perhaps the shared cultural agreement, that maintained such incredible uniformity across a subcontinent began to dissolve. Without the economic glue of that vast trade network, and without the symbolic language that facilitated it, the rationale for such rigid urban standardization may have simply evaporated. The cities were not just physical places, they were hubs in a delicate web of exchange and communication. When that web frayed, the logic of the hub itself was undermined. People did not forget how to make a pot or carve a seal. They simply stopped needing to make them in the exact same way as someone a month's journey away. This fragmentation of cultural and economic cohesion points not to a sudden invasion, but to a quiet unraveling of the connections that made a civilization feel like one entity. Yet when a grand system fragments, where do its pieces go? Do they shatter into nothing, or do they scatter like seeds, taking root in new forms elsewhere? The final act was not a dramatic fall, but a quiet scattering. When the great urban engines of the Indus began to stutter, their trade routes starved, their granaries stressed by an uncooperative climate, the people responded not with a last stand, but with a profound, practical adaptation. They chose resilience over rigidity. Picture the brilliant, concentrated light of a city like Mohenjo-Daro, a beacon of planning and collective effort. Now imagine that light slowly diffusing, breaking apart into hundreds, then thousands, of smaller points of light scattered across a vast landscape. This is the migration mosaic. The population did not vanish into thin air, they redistributed. Faced with the mounting challenges of sustaining such dense, complex urban centers, the most logical path forward was to return to a more flexible way of life. People likely moved out from the grand, gridlocked cities and into the countryside, establishing smaller villages and hamlets that were easier to sustain with local water sources and smaller-scale farming. This was a strategic retreat from overwhelming complexity to manageable simplicity. The archaeological evidence from the very late phases of the civilization supports this vividly. In what scholars call the late Harappan period, the material culture tells a story of localization. That once universal style of pottery, found from coast to mountain, begins to splinter into distinct regional varieties. Crafts become simpler, less standardized. The elaborate seals with their mysterious script fade away entirely, replaced by more basic symbols of personal identity. This isn't a story of cultural forgetting, but of cultural reorientation. The knowledge of how to make pottery, how to farm, how to weave, that didn't disappear. It simply stopped being coordinated by a distant urban authority. A potter no longer needed to make a jar that looked exactly like one from a city 500 miles away because the trade network that carried that jar had contracted. Instead, they made vessels suited to their immediate community's needs, often incorporating local materials and aesthetic preferences. This shift from a single, brilliant source of light to a constellation of smaller lights is the crucial mechanism for solving our central mystery. It explains how the magnificent brick-built cities could be abandoned to the dust, while the people and the deep well of their practical knowledge endured. The urban experiment for a time became unsustainable, but the experimenters, the farmers, the artisans, the families, they moved on, carrying their world with them in their minds and in their hands, ready to plant it in new soil. For generations, the story of the Indus decline was often told with a dramatic external villain. This narrative centered on waves of nomadic pastoralists, speakers of early Indo-European languages who migrated into the subcontinent from the northwest. These groups, often referred to in older texts as Aryans, were linked to the authors of the ancient Vedas, the foundational hymns of what would become Hinduism. The linguistic evidence is profound and undeniable. The Sanskrit of the Vedas shares deep roots with ancient Persian, Greek, and Latin, pointing to a distant, shared ancestral language. The cultural picture painted in the earliest Vedic texts is strikingly different from the urban, mercantile world of the Indus cities. It is a world of clans and cattle, of chariots and fire rituals, of a pantheon of gods like Indra, the wielder of the thunderbolt. Chronologically, the composition of these hymns seems to begin in the centuries following the Indus urban fade, suggesting a sequence of events where one culture's twilight overlapped with another's dawn. This alignment led to a compelling, sweeping story. A powerful, mobile culture swept in, its chariots overwhelming the citadels of a peaceful, settled people, bringing a new language and a new social order. It was a clean, dramatic break, a conquest that explained both a disappearance and a new beginning. But archaeology, as we have seen, tells a quieter, more complicated tale. The meticulous excavation of Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, and dozens of other sites has simply failed to produce the evidence such a violent conquest would leave behind. There are no layers of widespread destruction, no caches of new, foreign weapons buried in the streets of a sacked city, no sudden, complete replacement of one material culture by another. What we find instead is that slow fading, that gradual localization. So if the old invasion narrative does not fit the physical facts, how do we reconcile the undeniable arrival of new peoples and new ideas with the undeniable absence of war? The answer likely lies in shifting our perspective from a story of replacement to one of interaction and pressure. Imagine the subcontinent not as a fortified castle to be stormed, but as a vast, varied landscape undergoing significant stress. The Indus urban system was already straining under environmental and economic pressures, its population dispersing. Into this landscape of flux and reorganization came migratory groups, perhaps over decades or centuries, moving with their herds along familiar routes. Their arrival would not have been a single, coordinated military campaign, but a steady demographic seepage into a region where the old central authority was weakening. They brought a different way of life, a new language, and powerful new spiritual ideas. Their presence added another layer of complexity and, crucially, another source of competition for resources and influence in a changing world. They did not need to destroy mighty cities because those cities were already being quietly abandoned. They moved into a space that was, in many ways, opening up. This reframing is critical. It transforms the narrative from a catastrophic clash to a long, intricate process of cultural encounter. The Vedic world did not erase the Indus world in a battle. It began to weave itself into the fabric of a subcontinent where the descendants of the Indus people, with their own deep knowledge and traditions, were already living in new patterns. The real mystery, then, is not about who won or lost, but about what happened when these two great streams of human experience finally met and began to flow together. The most enduring legacies are often found not in grand monuments, but in the humble clay of the hearth. While the great cities emptied, the small, intimate rituals of daily life proved remarkably resilient. Archaeologists have unearthed thousands of terracotta figurines from Indus sites, objects that whisper of a domestic world that refused to fade. Among the most common are small, hand-modeled female figures, often adorned with elaborate headdresses and jewelry. These were not royal portraits, but likely objects of personal veneration, connected to hopes for fertility, protection, or the well-being of the household. Alongside them are delightful terracotta toy carts, complete with solid wheels and sometimes a little driver, echoing the full-sized versions that rumbled down the city streets. These were the playthings of Indus children, a simple, universal expression of imagination that bridges 4,000 years. The crafting of these figurines was a knowledge passed from hand to hand, from parent to child, in workshops and homes. When people dispersed from the urban centers, they did not abandon this knowledge. They took it with them into their new, smaller villages. Centuries later, across the villages of modern India and Pakistan, artisans continue to produce strikingly similar objects. The most powerful example is the bull. Indus craftsmen created vivid terracotta bulls, capturing a sense of powerful, coiled energy. That same reverence for the bull, and a nearly identical artistic style in depicting its sturdy hump and curved horns, appears in folk traditions right up to the modern era. You can find these terracotta bulls in village markets today, used in local rituals or as protective symbols in homes. As archaeologists note, this is not a case of direct, unbroken lineage from one specific Indus workshop to a specific modern village. It is something broader and more profound. It represents the survival of a cultural grammar, a shared set of symbols, artistic techniques, and ritual needs that transcended the collapse of the political and economic systems that once housed them. The knowledge of how to shape clay into a sacred form, the belief in what that form could represent, outlived the bricks of the bathhouse. This continuity in clay tells us that while the civilization's urban framework dissolved, its heart continued to beat in the quiet spaces of home, craft, and community faith. It suggests that the true transition was not a death, but a metamorphosis where the essence of the culture flowed into the deep, slow-moving river of folk tradition. If such tangible objects survived, what about the intangible world of symbols and beliefs? Could they have traveled the same hidden path? One of the most captivating artifacts ever found is a tiny square of soapstone, no larger than a postage stamp. Known as the Pashupati seal, it was discovered in the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro. Carved with astonishing precision, it shows a seated figure in what appears to be a deep meditative posture, legs crossed and heels pressed together. The figure has three faces gazing outward and is crowned with a magnificent headdress of horns. Surrounding this serene being are four animals: a rhinoceros, a buffalo, an elephant, and a tiger. A single mark beneath the seat might represent a flame. For over a century, this seal has been a Rosetta Stone of the spirit, a silent argument for cultural endurance. The posture is unmistakably yogic, predating the formal codification of yoga by thousands of years. The horned crown echoes later depictions of deities as lords of the natural world. Most tellingly, the title Pashupati itself is a Sanskrit name for the Hindu god Shiva, meaning Lord of all animals. In later iconography, Shiva is often shown as a peaceful ascetic, seated in meditation, master of the beasts and the elements. The connection is not a claim of direct identity, but a powerful echo. It suggests that certain core spiritual ideas, the pursuit of inner stillness, the concept of a divine master of nature, the symbolic power of the seated ascetic, were already being visualized and venerated in the Indus Valley. These concepts did not vanish with the cities. They lingered in the cultural memory, perhaps carried by the dispersing population, and centuries later found new expression, new names, and a central place in a different religious framework. The seal is not a portrait of the god Shiva as later millions would worship him. It is rather a profound prototype, a visual seed from which a mighty tree of tradition would later grow. This continuity of sacred imagery points to something deeper than trade or technology. It hints at the survival of a worldview. Alongside this figure, another symbol repeats with quiet insistence on countless seals and pottery fragments. the Pipal tree, often shown with a heart-shaped leaf and a distinctive branching pattern. Sometimes a figure is depicted kneeling in worship before it, or a mythical creature stands guard at its base. The Pipal, known today as the sacred fig or bodhi tree, held a place of clear veneration. Its depiction is not casual. It was a focus of reverence. Fast forward 2 millennia, and the Pipal tree remains one of the most potent living symbols in South Asia. It was under a Pipal tree that the Buddha is said to have attained enlightenment, making it the ultimate bodhi tree, the heart of Buddhist pilgrimage. In Hinduism, the tree is considered the abode of gods and a symbol of eternal life, often planted in temple courtyards and worshipped in its own right. The thread connecting an Indus seal to a Buddhist shrine or a Hindu temple is not a historical document, but a living tree. The reverence for it represents a different kind of knowledge transfer, one not written in ledgers but rooted in landscape and passed down through generations of ritual practice. What these symbols, the meditative lord and the sacred tree, reveal is a substratum. Beneath the later layers of Vedic ritual, philosophical complexity, and epic mythology, there appears to be an ancient bedrock of spiritual intuition. The Indus people seem to be exploring ideas of divine immanence in nature, the power of disciplined introspection, and the sanctity of specific elements in the living world. Their civilization's political and economic structures crumbled, but this symbolic vocabulary, this grammar of the sacred, proved incredibly durable. It was a language that later cultures could learn, adapt, and speak in their own powerful new dialects. If such profound spiritual concepts could flow across the centuries, what other, more tangible aspects of daily wisdom might have made the same journey? The same reverence for water that filled their reservoirs also shaped their most sacred spaces. At the very heart of Mohenjo-Daro, raised on a massive brick platform, sits a structure unlike any other from its time, the Great Bath. It is a perfect rectangle, lined with precisely fitted bricks sealed with a layer of bitumen to make it waterproof. A flight of steps leads down into the pool, and surrounding it are small private rooms and a sophisticated drainage system. This was no ordinary public pool. Its central location and meticulous construction mark it as a special place, almost certainly for ritual purification. Here, water was not just a practical resource for drinking or irrigation. It was a medium for spiritual cleansing, a physical act with profound symbolic meaning. This architectural statement reveals a cultural priority, a belief that purity, both of the body and of the spirit, was essential to communal life. Their entire civilization was, in a sense, an exercise in managed flow, from the gutters in their streets to the channels in their docks, demonstrating a mastery over water that served both the practical and the profound. When the cities were left behind, this deep-seated cultural value did not simply evaporate. It found a new home, a new architectural form, and a new religious vocabulary. Centuries later, in the evolving traditions of Hinduism, the concept of shaucham, or ritual purity, became a cornerstone of practice. And just as the Indus people gave this idea a physical form in the Great Bath, later temple architects gave it form in the Kund, the sacred step tank. Visit any major Hindu temple complex across South Asia, from the Sun Temple of Madhura to the great southern temples of Tamil Nadu, and you will find these beautiful, geometrically precise reservoirs. Before entering the inner sanctum to stand before the deity, devotees are expected to perform ablutions, to wash their hands, feet, and face in the waters of the temple tank. This act is not about hygiene in a modern medical sense. It is a ceremonial transition, a shedding of the dust and distractions of the outside world to prepare the individual for a sacred encounter. The architectural lineage is stunning. Like the Great Bath, these temple tanks are often masterpieces of engineering, built with careful attention to water sources, steps for descent, and symbolic design. They are central to the temple layout, not an afterthought. This is not to say a temple architect in the 10th century looked at ruins of Mohenjo-Daro for inspiration. The connection is far more organic. It suggests that a fundamental cultural principle that clean, flowing water is a conduit to the sacred, a necessary element for preparing a space or a person for higher purpose, survived the dispersal of the urban population. This value was carried in daily practice and spiritual longing, and when grand religious architecture began to rise again in the subcontinent, it naturally demanded a vessel for that value. The Great Bath did not become a temple tank, but the idea it so perfectly embodied did. The water that once filled a Bronze Age pool in Mohenjo-Daro still flows conceptually down the steps of 1,000 temple tanks, connecting the act of an Indus priest to that of a modern pilgrim through a continuous, unbroken reverence for the purifying power of water. A civilization's most practical tools can become its most enduring legacy. Beyond the sacred and the symbolic, the Indus people were masters of a different kind of language, one of pure mathematics and commerce. Their system of weights is a marvel of Bronze Age standardization. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of these small, carefully shaped stone cubes from sites across the entire civilization, from the coast to the distant highlands. They are made from a dense, fine-grained stone called chert, crafted with a precision that speaks of centralized control and immense care. The system itself is elegantly logical, based on a consistent unit. The most common weight is a cube that measures about 13.7 grams. From this foundation, they built a decimal system. You find weights that are double that unit, 4 times, 8 times, and so on, following a perfect binary progression. A merchant in the bustling port of Lothal and a trader in the northern city of Harappa could place their goods on opposite sides of a simple balance scale, using these identical weights, and conduct business with flawless trust. This was the invisible infrastructure of their vast economy, the shared rulebook that allowed cotton from one region to be fairly exchanged for lapis lazuli from another. It enabled the complex, long-distance trade that defined their prosperity. When the urban network fragmented, one might assume this precise, administrative knowledge would be among the first things lost. But something remarkable happened. The concept and even the specific standard did not disappear. Centuries later, as new cities and kingdoms began to rise in the early historic period across the Gangetic Plain, a new system of weights emerged. Scholars studying these later weights, used in the time of the Buddha and the early Mauryan Empire, made a stunning observation. The dominant weight unit in these new economies was remarkably close to the old Indus standard. The Pashupati, a weight mentioned in ancient texts and found in archaeological sites, consistently clusters around 13.7 grams. The correlation is too precise to be coincidence. It suggests a thread of practical knowledge that was never severed. The administrators of Mohenjo-Daro may have vanished, but the farmers, metal workers, and local traders who dispersed from the cities carried with them an intuitive understanding of a fair weight, a memory of the standard that had governed their markets. This knowledge likely persisted in regional marketplaces for generations, a folk memory of measure passed down alongside techniques for potting and planting. Then, when large-scale trade and urbanization began to re-emerge, demanding a reliable system of value, this old standard was there, ready to be formalized once again. It was not a rediscovery of a buried artifact, but the resurfacing of a living practice. The survival of this metrological system is perhaps the clearest proof of all. It shows that the collapse was not an erasure. The most brilliant innovations of the Indus civilization, their urban planning, their water management, their spiritual symbols, were not locked away in their abandoned cities. They were carried in the collective memory of the people who left. The weights demonstrate that even the abstract concept of standardized trade, the very engine of a complex society, outlasted the society's political form. It was a tool too valuable to forget, a piece of intellectual technology that simply found new hands to hold it. The silent script of the Indus seals is not the only language that carries their echo. Words themselves can become artifacts buried not in soil but in the very structure of speech. When a new language sweeps into a region, it does not arrive into a vacuum. It encounters a landscape already named, filled with plants, animals, and places that the local people have been describing for generations. Often, the newcomers do not invent entirely new words for these things. They adopt the existing local terms, absorbing them into their own vocabulary. Linguists call these borrowed terms a substrate, a hidden layer of an older language preserved within a newer one like a fossil in stone. This is where our search leads next, into the tapestry of Sanskrit, the language of the Vedas. The hymns of the Rig Veda are the proud, poetic voice of the incoming pastoral groups, celebrating their gods, their victories, and their way of life. Yet, woven into this ancient text are words that stubbornly resist a clear Indo-European origin. They stand out as linguistic puzzles. Take the word for a towering, fragrant tree native to the subcontinent, the shola or sola tree. Its name does not easily trace back to ancient Persian or Greek roots. Similarly, the word for a peacock, mayura, and for a type of wild elephant, ibha, seem to be borrowings. These are not words for abstract concepts or chariot parts, which the newcomers already had. They are words for the very substance of the Indian landscape, its flora, its fauna, its local realities. The most compelling examples might be place names. Many major rivers in northwestern India and Pakistan, like the Indus itself, bear names that are not easily explained by Sanskrit. The word Indus likely derives from the local word Sind, meaning simply river or sea. When the Persian and Greek worlds later heard this term, it became Hindu and Indus, eventually giving the entire subcontinent its name. This suggests that the most fundamental geographical markers were learned by the newcomers from the people already living there. Think of it as a quiet, daily negotiation. A Vedic herder new to the region points to a tree and asks a local farmer, "What do you call that?" The farmer gives the name, and the herder adopts it because no equivalent word exists in his own tongue. Over generations, these adopted words become naturalized citizens of the new language. While we cannot prove that any specific word like mayura came directly from the lost Indus language, the pattern is deeply suggestive. It points to a process of cultural and linguistic blending that was practical, not hostile. The incoming groups were not erasing the existing world, they were learning its names, and in doing so, they were preserving a fragment of the worldview of the people they encountered. These substrate words are like linguistic ghosts, faint but persistent traces of a voice that otherwise left no written record. They remind us that even when a script is silent and a city is empty, a culture can still whisper its presence through the words it gave to the land itself. The river of tradition found its deepest channel not in royal courts, but in the soil of the village. While the grand narratives of history often follow kings and conquerors, the most resilient forms of culture are those that live close to the earth, woven into the seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest. Across the villages of South Asia for thousands of years, people have worshipped a different kind of divine presence. These are the Grama devatas, the village deities, and they tell a story of spiritual survival. Unlike the gods of the Sanskrit Vedas who rule from celestial heights, these goddesses and guardians are intimately local. They are the protectors of a specific boundary, the healers of a particular spring, the fierce mothers who ward off smallpox or bring rain to a parched field. Their shrines are often simple, a painted stone under a tree, a terracotta figure in a grove, and their rituals are led not by Brahmin priests reciting ancient verses, but by local healers and elders speaking the language of the community. This layer of faith is ancient, pragmatic, and profoundly connected to the immediate realities of agrarian life. Scholars suggest that this entire stratum of belief may represent a direct, unbroken undercurrent from the deep past, possibly from the pre-Vedic indigenous cultures of the subcontinent, of which the Indus was a major part. Consider the evidence. The Indus seals show a clear reverence for the natural world, trees, animals, and perhaps a mother goddess figure linked to fertility. The village goddess tradition is precisely that, a spiritual system rooted in nature, fertility, and protection. A goddess like Shitala, worshipped for centuries as both the bringer and curer of diseases like smallpox, embodies a very Indus-like practicality. She is not a distant cosmic force, but a divine power intertwined with the most fundamental human experiences of health, illness, and the hope for community well-being. Her worship involves offerings that are agricultural products, and her festivals mark the turning of the seasons. This is a spirituality of immediacy, one that would have made perfect sense to the farmers and potters who left the great cities to rebuild their lives in smaller, earth-bound communities. When the urban framework collapsed, this type of belief did not need temples or a priestly class to sustain it. It traveled in the stories grandmothers told, in the rituals performed at a family hearth, in the collective memory of what forces needed appeasement to ensure a child's health or a successful harvest. The Sanskritic pantheon, with its cosmic order and philosophical depth, flowed into the subcontinent like a great river, but the folk traditions were the water table, invisible and essential, nourishing the roots of daily life from below. They provided a vessel, a resilient and adaptable container, into which the essence of an older worldview could be poured and carried forward, generation after generation. This cultural undercurrent ensured that even as new languages were spoken and new gods were praised in temples, a primal understanding of the sacred, one that valued locality, fertility, and protection, never died. It simply went underground, resurfacing in 1,000 village festivals, where the real continuity of a civilization is often found not in its abandoned monuments, but in its living prayers. The order of their streets was a kind of philosophy set in brick, while the vast, continent-spanning urban network of the Indus dissolved. The underlying principles of their planning proved too valuable to discard. They had mastered a way of organizing space that served both community and cosmos, and that knowledge did not disappear into the ruins. Instead, it scattered like seeds, taking root in new forms. Consider the fundamental orientation of their cities. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were laid out with an almost obsessive attention to cardinal directions, their main streets aligning closely with north-south and east-west axes. This was not random. It reflected an understanding of the sun's path, the wind's direction, and a desire to bring human habitation into harmony with the larger patterns of the natural world. This principle of alignment, this sacred geometry of daily life, found powerful echoes centuries later, when large-scale urban planning re-emerged in the subcontinent during the early historic period. In cities mentioned by travelers and in Buddhist texts, that same sensibility was often present. The great city of Taxila, for instance, though rebuilt many times, shows clear evidence of deliberate, sector-based planning in its earliest phases, with careful consideration for drainage and public spaces. Even more enduring was the conceptual legacy of the citadel. In Indus cities, the raised, fortified western sector housed larger structures and likely served as an administrative and ceremonial center, physically and symbolically separate from the lower town. This idea of a defined, elevated space of authority or sanctity resonates deeply in later Indian urban design. The concept of the Rajadhiraja, the royal citadel, became a standard feature of medieval fortified towns. More subtly, the layout of countless traditional villages and temple towns across India often places the most sacred structure, the temple itself, on a slightly raised platform or at the head of the main axis, echoing that ancient separation of the spiritually significant from the mundane. This continuity is perhaps most beautifully codified in Vastu Shastra, the ancient Indian science of architecture and spatial design. While the full textual tradition of Vastu developed much later, its core principles feel like a philosophical elaboration of the practical wisdom the Indus builders lived by. Vastu emphasizes precise orientation, the strategic placement of water sources and waste systems, the zoning of spaces for specific functions, and the creation of a central, open courtyard, all concepts demonstrably present in the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro. The genius was not in the specific blueprints they left behind, which were suited to their time and climate. The genius was in the underlying template, a template for creating ordered, healthy, and harmonious living spaces. That template was not lost in the dispersal. It was carried in the collective memory of builders, masons, and community elders. When the time came to plan a new town or a king's capital, this inherited wisdom provided a foundation, ready to be adapted to new materials, new rulers, and new gods. The grid of Mohenjo-Daro did not directly become the street plan of a medieval city, but the idea that human settlement should be a deliberate, thoughtful reflection of cosmic order never faded away. It simply learned to speak in new architectural languages. Their genius was not only in grand plans, but in the smallest of treasures. In the workshops of Lothal and Mohenjo-Daro, artisans achieved a level of technical mastery that would define luxury for centuries. They worked with materials that tested the limits of Bronze Age skill. Carnelian, a hard, reddish stone, was a particular specialty. To transform a rough nodule into a perfect, glossy bead, they followed a process of breathtaking precision. First, the stone was carefully flaked and ground into a rough shape. Then came the true marvel, drilling a hole through this incredibly hard material. They used a bow drill with a copper tip, but the real secret was the abrasive. Archaeologists believe they employed a fine powder of a mineral even harder than carnelian, perhaps emery or crushed jasper, mixed with oil. With patient, sustained rotation, this abrasive paste would slowly, grain by grain, grind its way through the stone. The result was a long, barrel-shaped bead with a hole so fine and consistent it seems impossible for its time. But their artistry did not stop there. Some carnelian beads were subjected to a transformative heat treatment. By carefully controlling temperature in a kiln, the artisans could deepen the stone's red color to a rich, translucent crimson, a hue that was highly prized across the ancient world. This was not casual craft. This was a high-level technology, a series of closely guarded steps that required specialized tools, exact temperatures, and generations of accumulated knowledge. When the urban centers that housed these elite workshops declined, one might expect such a delicate, complex technology to vanish. Yet it did not. Centuries later, in the very region of Gujarat where Indus cities like Lothal had thrived, bead-making of astonishing quality continued. The craft did not disappear, it migrated and persisted. In the early historic period, sites in this region produced carnelian beads that are virtually indistinguishable in technique and style from their Indus predecessors. The same long barrel shapes, the same fine, consistent drilling, the same deep, heat-treated glow. This continuity is a powerful clue. It tells us that the knowledge was not stored in a library or a royal warehouse. It was stored in the hands and minds of the artisans themselves, in the muscle memory of grinding and the trained eye for temperature. These craftspeople likely formed tight-knit guilds or family lineages, passing their trade secrets from master to apprentice as a sacred trust. When economic or environmental pressures forced them to leave their urban workshops, they did not abandon their craft. They took their skills with them, setting up smaller, more localized workshops in new communities. The market for such luxury goods may have changed, but the demand for beauty and status did not. A local chieftain or a wealthy merchant in a post-Indus village would still covet a strand of brilliant red carnelian, creating a niche that kept the craft alive. This survival of high technical skill is a direct, tangible thread. It shows that the collapse was not a blanket forgetting. the most sophisticated practical knowledge, the kind that turned stone into jewelry and ore into metal, was too valuable to lose. It flowed along hidden channels of apprenticeship and family tradition, ensuring that the beadmaker's legacy, like the weight of a chert cube, was a measure of value that truly endured. The foods we eat tell a story of deep, quiet belonging. While empires rose and fell, the most fundamental relationship between people and the land was being written in seeds and bones. Archaeologists sifting through the dust of Indus settlements find a remarkably consistent pantry. The charred remains of ancient grains reveal a sophisticated agricultural system built on a foundation of wheat and barley, supplemented by a variety of pulses like lentils, peas, and chickpeas. This was not a subsistence diet, but a calculated, diverse farming strategy that provided balanced nutrition and resilience against crop failure. They cultivated sesame for oil and even grew cotton, not for food, but for the cloth that became a legendary export. This agricultural package was so successful, so perfectly adapted to the soils and seasons of the region, that it became the permanent bedrock of South Asian subsistence. Centuries after the cities faded, farmers across the subcontinent were still planting the same basic crops, a testament to the enduring wisdom of those first agriculturalists. Their knowledge of the land, of when to sow and when to reap, was a form of technology too vital to lose. It was carried forward in the hands of every farmer who prepared a field, a continuous thread of practical understanding that wove through every political upheaval. But the continuity extends beyond the plants in the field to the animals that shared their world. Among the most distinctive finds in Indus sites are the remains of the humped cattle, the zebu. This was not just a source of meat, but a living engine of the economy, a draft animal for plowing fields, a source of milk, leather, and dung for fuel. The zebu was so integral to their way of life that its image appears everywhere, from tiny terracotta figurines to the majestic seals. The survival and continued dominance of the zebu across the Indian subcontinent to this day is one of the most powerful arguments for cultural continuity. The breeding knowledge, the understanding of its care, and its central role in agrarian life did not disappear with the urban planners. It moved with the dispersing population into new villages, where the relationship between farmer and cattle remained the heartbeat of rural existence. This unbroken chain of daily sustenance forms a profound kind of evidence. Political systems can shatter, languages can evolve, and gods can be renamed, but the need to eat, to feed a family from the soil, remains constant. The enduring agricultural base of wheat, barley, pulses, and zebu cattle demonstrates that while the superstructure of Indus civilization transformed, its foundation never crumbled. The true legacy of those ancient city dwellers was not only in their bricks, but in the very bread that sustained the millions who came after, a quiet inheritance passed down with every harvest. Their mastery of the land was matched only by their command of the sea. At the edge of the salt marshes in Gujarat, the city of Lothal presents a startling sight, a vast brick-lined basin, over 200 feet long, connected by a channel to a nearby river that once flowed to the Arabian Sea. This was not a reservoir or a ritual bath. The structure's design, with a locking gate mechanism to control water levels against the tide, marks it unmistakably as a dockyard, the earliest known in the world. Here, the goods of the Indus civilization, the Carnelian beads, the cotton cloth, the exotic woods were loaded onto sturdy, plank-built ships. From this engineered harbor, those ships caught the predictable winds of the monsoon, carrying their cargo westward to the ports of Dilmun and Magan, what we know today as Bahrain and Oman, and from there to the great cities of Mesopotamia. This was not casual coastal hopping. It was organized, long-distance maritime trade, a testament to an advanced understanding of hydrography, astronomy for navigation, and shipbuilding. The knowledge required to build such a dock, to construct vessels capable of surviving open ocean voyages, and to harness the seasonal monsoon winds was immense and specialized. It resided in the minds of shipwrights, pilots, and traders. When the urban networks inland began to fragment, one might assume this sophisticated, niche knowledge would be the first to evaporate. But the sea has a long memory, and coastal communities are deeply conservative in their practical wisdom. The families of Lothal sailors and dockworkers did not forget the rhythms of the waves or the shape of a hull. They likely dispersed along the coastline, settling in smaller fishing and trading villages, carrying their irreplaceable nautical knowledge with them. This maritime memory became a living, subsurface current. Centuries later, when new empires like the Mauryans under Emperor Ashoka sought to expand trade and diplomacy across the Indian Ocean, they did not start from zero. The foundational knowledge of the monsoon routes, of harbor construction, and of ship design was already there, preserved in the oral traditions and daily practices of coastal communities. This legacy would swell again millennia later, powering the magnificent oceanic expeditions of the Chola dynasty, whose ships reached Southeast Asia. The dock at Lothal did not directly father the Chola navy, but the deep-seated confidence to build, sail, and trade across the open ocean, that cultural attitude toward the sea, very likely did. The sea itself became a conduit, not just for goods, but for the persistence of a way of thinking, ensuring that a civilization's reach did not end where its land did. The sea routes they pioneered were only one current in a much larger cultural river. Centuries after the last brick was laid in Mohenjo-Daro, a new kind of energy began to gather far to the east in the fertile plains of the Ganges River. Around 600 years before the Common Era, a remarkable transformation swept across northern India, a period scholars call the Second Urbanization. Great cities like Taxila in the northwest and Varanasi on the banks of the Ganges rose to prominence, bustling centers of trade, philosophy, and political power. This was the crucible that forged entirely new world religions like Buddhism and Jainism, and it can feel like a completely fresh beginning, a stark rebirth after a long, quiet interlude. But look closer, and the echoes of a much older conversation become audible. This was not a brand new start built on empty ground. It was a profound synthesis, a melting pot where the surviving streams of knowledge from the past met and mingled with powerful new ideas. The Ganges plain became a meeting point. Into this fertile region came the Vedic traditions with their Sanskrit hymns and evolving priestly rituals. But they were not arriving into a vacuum. The land was already inhabited by the descendants of those who had dispersed from the earlier urban experiment, people who carried with them the deep, practical wisdom of their ancestors, the knowledge of weights and measures, of bead making and metalworking, of water management and town planning. Imagine a potter from a village that had preserved Indus ceramic techniques for generations, now selling his wares in the new market of Varanasi, or a local administrator drawing on an inherited, intuitive sense of fair measure to help standardize trade in the growing city of Taxila. These were not people calling themselves Harappans, but they were the bearers of a technological and cultural substrate that had never truly vanished. This interaction created a unique ferment. The Vedic world provided a new linguistic and philosophical framework, a cosmic order explored in the Upanishads. The indigenous, practical knowledge provided the grounded, material expertise to build the physical world that framework would inhabit. When a new city was planned, the principles of orientation and drainage that resurfaced were not invented from nothing. When a merchant kingdom standardized its coinage, the concept of a reliable weight system was already a living memory in the marketplace. This synthesis is what made the explosion of the Second Urbanization so dynamic and innovative. It was in this mixed, questioning, and incredibly productive environment that radical new thinkers arose. Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, and Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, walked the roads between these new cities, challenging old hierarchies and proposing paths to enlightenment that were accessible to all. Their teachings did not emerge in isolation. They were a philosophical response to a world in flux, a world being reshaped by renewed urban complexity, trade, and the mingling of very different cultural streams. The rise of Buddhism and Jainism, and the renewed urban life that supported them, was arguably the magnificent result of this long, slow fusion. The first urbanization left a legacy not of ruins but of resilient ideas. And in the Ganges Valley, those ideas finally found a new voice, helping to build a world that would shape Asia for millennia to come. The most personal choices can carry the deepest history. In the quiet corners of Indus homes, amidst the pottery and tools, archaeologists find collections of bangles. They are made from humble materials, shells gathered from the coast, clay baked into terracotta rings, and sometimes copper or bronze shaped into gleaming circles. These were not rare treasures for the elite, but common items, found in such abundance that they speak of a universal practice. The evidence suggests these bangles were worn primarily by women, adorning wrists in stacks that would have chimed softly with every movement. Alongside them, in some burials, researchers have noted traces of a red pigment, often near the hairline of female remains. While we cannot be certain of its exact ancient use, this hints at the possible application of vermilion, a red powder with profound symbolic meaning. These were not merely decorations, they were a silent language of identity, perhaps marking life stages, marital status, or invoking protection and auspiciousness. The bangle and the touch of red were intimate rituals, a part of daily dressing that connected the individual to a larger community of women and a shared understanding of the world. When the cities emptied, these small, personal habits did not vanish from memory. They were packed away with other essentials, carried into new villages and new lives because they spoke to something too fundamental to leave behind. Centuries later, across the villages and cities of South Asia, the cultural echoes are unmistakable. The tradition of women wearing bangles, often in sets from wrist to forearm, remains a vibrant and essential part of dress, especially during weddings and festivals. The materials evolved: glass, lacquer, gold, and plastic replaced shell and terracotta, but the form and its social significance endured. Similarly, the application of sindoor, the vermilion powder in the hair parting, became one of the most potent symbols of married life for millions. This is not a claim of direct, unbroken ritual from a specific Indus home to a specific modern one. It is evidence of a cultural grammar so powerful it survived the collapse of every system that once framed it. The grammar of adornment, of using ornament and color to communicate place in the social and cosmic order, proved incredibly resilient. This knowledge did not travel through royal decrees or sacred texts. It traveled along the most intimate and powerful channel possible, from mother to daughter, from elder to younger, in the quiet moments of preparing for the day or for a wedding. It was taught not with words but with hands tying a bracelet or applying a dot of color. In this way, the most fragile objects, shells and clay, guarded the strongest of continuities. While empires were forgotten and languages transformed, the memory of what a woman wore on her wrist and what it meant to her community was passed down like a sacred heirloom, an unbroken thread woven through time in the simple, enduring acts of daily life. The idea of a dark age is a powerful narrative, but archaeology is now quietly rewriting that story. For a long time, historians looked at the centuries following the Indus urban decline and saw a void, a cultural blank page waiting for the Vedic hymns to be written upon it. This framing suggested a catastrophic break, a civilizational reset that left little behind. But newer discoveries are painting a far more interesting and continuous picture. The so-called gap between the Indus cities and the rise of new kingdoms in the Ganges plain was not empty. It was filled with vibrant, regional cultures that show us a society in transition, not in oblivion. Take the cemetery H culture in the Punjab region, named for a distinctive type of pottery found at the site of Harappa itself. This culture emerged in the very same places where Indus cities once stood, but its material life was different. Their pottery was painted with bold, geometric designs and stylized figures of peacocks and bulls. Their burial practices shifted, showing a preference for pot burials containing remains. For decades, these differences were seen as proof of a complete cultural replacement, perhaps by new people, but a closer look reveals a more nuanced story. The pottery, while different in style, was still made on wheels and fired in kilns, a direct technological inheritance. The animals painted on the pots, the bull and the peacock, were animals deeply significant to the Indus world. This suggests not a sudden erasure, but a transformation. The old symbols and crafts were being actively reinterpreted, adapted to new social and perhaps spiritual needs by communities that were reorganizing themselves. Similarly, across the upper Ganges-Yamuna plains, archaeologists identify the ochre-colored pottery culture. These communities lived in smaller settlements, and their namesake pottery has a distinctive russet hue. They were not building great cities, but they were mastering copper metallurgy on a significant scale. Their material culture shows both new elements and subtle links to the older Indus technological base. What these regional cultures demonstrate is a process scholars call localization or regionalization. When the vast, unifying network of Indus trade and administration dissolved, it did not vaporize the population. Instead, people coalesced into smaller, more localized groups. In these groups, the grand, standardized styles of the past gave way to more localized expressions. A potter no longer needed to make a jar for a centralized warehouse, so they began to decorate it with motifs important to their immediate community. The knowledge of how to make the pot, however, the wheel, the kiln, the clay preparation remained intact. This reframing is crucial. It changes the narrative from one of death and darkness to one of adaptation and resilience. The centuries after the cities were not a dark age of forgetting. They were a period of active reshaping where the cultural materials of the Indus civilization, its technologies, its symbolic vocabulary, its practical wisdom, were broken down and reassembled into new regional forms. The civilization did not end in a sudden crash. It dissolved into 1,000 streams, each carrying forward pieces of the whole. This reassessment asks us to reconsider what collapse really means. If the people, their skills, and their core symbols endured and evolved, can we truly say the culture died? Or did it simply learn to speak in new, more localized dialects, preparing the seedbed for everything that would grow next? Language holds the echoes of ancient migrations. While the Vedic hymns were composed in Sanskrit, another family of languages thrived in the subcontinent, one with roots that may reach back to the very dawn of settled life. This is the Dravidian family, encompassing major languages like Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam, spoken by hundreds of millions in southern India today. The theory that the builders of the Indus cities spoke a very early form of these languages, a Proto-Dravidian tongue, is one of the most fascinating and debated ideas in unraveling this mystery. The argument is not built on a deciphered script, but on subtle, persistent clues that suggest a linguistic layer older than Sanskrit in the northern landscape. Consider place names. Many towns and rivers in the northwest, the heartland of the Indus civilization, bear names that do not yield a clear meaning in Sanskrit or later Indo-Aryan languages. These names often end in sounds like uru, meaning town or settlement, a suffix common in Dravidian languages. It is as if the map itself retains a ghostly imprint of an older naming convention, a geographical memory that outlasted a change in the dominant language. More compelling is the case of Brahui, a language spoken by nearly 3 million people in the rugged hills of Balochistan in modern Pakistan. Surrounded by Indo-Aryan languages for centuries, Brahui is a startling linguistic island. It is not related to its neighbors. It is unmistakably a Dravidian language. How did a language with clear kinship to Tamil end up isolated over 1,000 miles from its sister tongues? The most plausible explanation is that Brahui is a relic, a surviving fragment of a much larger Dravidian-speaking zone that once covered the northwest. According to this hypothesis, the ancestors of today's Dravidian speakers were not always confined to the south. They may have been the original inhabitants of the Indus Valley, the people who built Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. As their urban system fragmented and new groups arrived, a long, slow southward migration could have carried the bulk of this language family to its current home, while a small, resilient community held on in the northern highlands, preserving Brahui against all odds. This model offers a powerful narrative for cultural transmission. It suggests that the great exodus from the Indus cities did not just scatter people and technologies, but an entire language family and its associated world of stories, poetry, and thought. The sophisticated cultural complexes that later flowered in South India, with their own rich literary traditions and social structures, would not be separate creations, but transformed legacies carried south and nurtured over centuries. While this hypothesis is not proven and the Indus script remains silent, it provides a compelling framework. It turns the map into a story of resilience, showing how a civilization's most intimate possession, its language, could travel across a continent, holding within its grammar and vocabulary the unspoken memory of a lost world. Perhaps the most powerful stories are those born from shared trauma. Across the ancient world, one narrative appears with startling consistency, a tale of divine anger, rising waters, and a single family chosen to survive. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh gives us Utnapishtim, warned by a god to build a great boat and save the seed of all living things. This story is famously echoed in the Hebrew Bible. But the same deep current flows through the sacred texts of India. Centuries after the Indus cities faded, the Shatapatha Brahmana, a Vedic text, recounts the story of Manu. A tiny fish comes to Manu, pleading for protection. He cares for it, and it grows to enormous size, eventually revealing a great flood is coming. The fish instructs Manu to build a ship, and when the deluge arrives, it tows the vessel to safety on a northern mountain. Later, in the vast mythological compendiums known as the Puranas, this story evolves further, with the fish revealed as an incarnation of the god Vishnu himself. The parallels are too specific to dismiss as coincidence. A warning, a divinely ordained boat, a catastrophic flood that destroys humanity, and a single righteous survivor who restarts the cycle of life. These are not historical records, but they are cultural memories distilled into myth. The question this raises is profound. Could these stories, especially the Indian versions that took shape in the land once dominated by the Indus civilization, preserve a collective memory of real, catastrophic environmental change? The geological and climatic evidence we have already explored points to a period of immense instability for the Indus people, with shifting river courses and unpredictable, torrential monsoons leading to devastating floods. Imagine the scale of such an event for a riverine civilization. A catastrophic breach of the Indus or the Gagahakra, or a series of monstrous storm surges along the coast, would have been an epoch-defining catastrophe. It would have reshaped the literal landscape and scarred the cultural psyche. For generations, the story would be told around hearths, a warning and an explanation for why the world had changed. When the urban framework dissolved and new cultural groups arrived, this foundational story did not vanish. Instead, it performed the same act of resilience as a terracotta figurine or a weight standard. It translated. The characters and divine actors changed to fit new belief systems. A Vedic sage replaced a Sumerian king. The protector became the god Vishnu, but the core narrative of a world-cleansing flood remained intact. This is how a civilization endures when its cities fall. It encodes its most traumatic and defining experiences into story, a package that can be retold and re-sacralized by completely different peoples centuries later. The flood myths are not a history book, but they are a testament. They suggest that the people of the Indus Valley did not just leave behind bricks and beads. They left an echo of the water's roar, a memory of survival against impossible odds, woven forever into the epic memory of the land itself. The revolution was not written in stone, but spun from clay. Among the many technological marvels of the Indus world, one of the most quietly transformative was the fast potter's wheel. This was not the slow, hand-turned platform used for millennia, but a device that could spin with sustained momentum, driven by a kick from the potter's foot or an assistant's hand. Its introduction during the civilization's mature period changed everything. For the first time, a single artisan could produce dozens of identical, thin-walled, perfectly symmetrical vessels in a single day. This was the birth of true mass production in the subcontinent, a leap that turned pottery from a slow, individual craft into the engine of a standardized economy. The evidence is in the sheer volume and uniformity of the pots found across 1,000 miles of territory. Storage jars, cooking vessels, and elegant drinking cups, all bearing the telltale concentric rings left by that spinning wheel. This consistency fed the cities, as grain could be stored in identical containers and goods shipped in uniform packages. But when those cities emptied, the wheel did not stop spinning. The knowledge of how to build the wheel, balance it, and throw clay upon it was not stored in a library or a royal workshop. It was stored in the hands and muscle memory of the potters themselves. These artisans, essential to every community's daily life, dispersed with the population. They carried their wheels and their skills into new villages, from the foothills of the Himalayas to the coasts of the south. There was never a moment when people forgot how to make a proper pot. The fast wheel was a tool too vital, too embedded in the rhythm of daily sustenance to be abandoned. Its continuous, unbroken use from the Bronze Age to the present day across South Asia represents something profound. It is the survival of a fundamental industrial technique, a silent engine of cultural continuity that hummed beneath the rise and fall of kingdoms. While empires declared themselves in grand proclamations, the potter's wheel kept turning, generation after generation, shaping the clay of everyday existence. This unassuming technology ensured that even as political systems transformed, the basic container of life, the bowl that held a family's meal, remained connected by an unbroken thread of spinning motion to a world 4,000 years distant. The Bronze Age was an era of magnificent, fragile giants. At nearly the same time the Indus cities were fading, other titanic civilizations were also shuddering to a halt. To the west, the Akkadian Empire, the world's first true empire, fractured under the strain of drought and rebellion. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom, builder of the pyramids, dissolved into a period of disunity and scarcity. These were dramatic downfalls, often marked by the collapse of central authority, the abandonment of writing systems, and the fragmentation of a unifying cultural identity. The story told by ruins and texts is often one of a hard break, where the political and ideological core of a civilization shatters, leaving its pieces to be gathered by new powers who tell a different story. The fall of the Akkadian Empire did not see its gods and cuneiform script seamlessly adopted by the peoples that followed. The collapse created a void, a cultural interregnum. The Indus story, when placed beside these others, reveals a startling and profound contrast. Here, we do not see a clean, hard break, but a slow, osmotic process. The central political authority and the specific urban model dissolved, yes. Yet the cultural core, the practical technologies, the spiritual symbols, the daily habits did not shatter. Instead, it demonstrated an incredible permeability. It seeped into the landscape and into the lives of the people who remained, and it showed a resilient capacity to be absorbed, adapted, and carried forward by entirely new communities. This is the unique signature of the Indus transformation, where other collapses often represent an ending followed by a new beginning. The Indus experience suggests a metamorphosis. The civilization did not topple like a stone monument, leaving only rubble to be cleared away. It dissolved like salt in water, becoming an invisible yet essential part of the cultural sea that would nourish all that grew after. This comparative view reframes our entire understanding of collapse. It asks us to see resilience not in the survival of a state or a king's name, but in the quiet, stubborn persistence of a way of life, one that proved flexible enough to travel without an army and durable enough to speak in languages its original creators might never have understood. The past is never truly gone. It is a story we choose to tell about ourselves. In the modern nations that now share the geography of the Indus, this ancient civilization has been embraced as a powerful origin point, a symbol of pride that reaches back thousands of years before colonial maps were drawn. For Pakistan, the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa stand within its borders, tangible anchors of a deep, indigenous heritage that predates the arrival of Islam. They are celebrated as proof of a sophisticated, homegrown urban tradition, a narrative that fosters national unity and a sense of historical depth. Across the border in India, the civilization is often woven into a broader, continuous narrative of Indic civilization. The perceived links between Indus symbols and later Hindu iconography are highlighted, suggesting an unbroken cultural lineage that makes the ancient Indus people spiritual and cultural ancestors. This is not merely academic interest, it is the active work of memory, where an ancient, stateless society is recruited to serve the identity of modern nation-states. The very mystery of its disappearance becomes a blank canvas upon which different visions of the past and future can be projected. The search for connection is not confined to textbooks or political speeches. It pulses through popular culture. You can find the enigmatic script from the seals printed on T-shirts and notebook covers, a fashionable cipher of ancient wisdom. The iconic figure from the Pashupati seal, with its yogic posture, is reinterpreted in modern art and meditation iconography, a bridge between a Bronze Age artifact and contemporary spiritual seeking. Video games and novels set in fantasy worlds borrow the aesthetic of orderly, brick-built cities and mysterious, undeciphered languages, all echoing the allure of the Indus. This popular fascination reveals a deep human desire. In a fractured, fast-paced modern world, the image of a peaceful, planned, and seemingly harmonious urban society holds a powerful, almost utopian appeal. Its endurance is not just in beads or weights, but in its enduring capacity to inspire. The civilization's greatest legacy may be its flexibility, its ability to mean different things to different people, all while remaining fundamentally itself, a silent, sophisticated partner in an ongoing conversation about who we are and where we came from. The script remains silent on its most intimate pages. For all we have traced of their legacy, the Indus people's own voice is still locked away in those elegant, miniature seals. Their script, composed of around 400 distinct signs, is the last great cipher of the ancient world. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform, it has no bilingual Rosetta Stone, no known descendant language to provide a key. We can see it was written from right to left, and that it likely represented a spoken language, but the meaning of those animal figures and geometric shapes remains a profound mystery. Are they names of merchants, prayers to gods, or records of grain shipments? Until someone cracks this code, a central chamber of their world remains dark to us. This silence extends to their political life. Who governed these meticulously planned cities? Was it a council of elders, a priestly class, or a dynasty of kings whose names we will never know? The absence of palaces or grandiose royal tombs argues against a single, all-powerful ruler in the style of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Yet the incredible uniformity across a subcontinent suggests some form of remarkable coordination. Was it a shared ideology, a religious consensus that held this vast network together? We simply do not know. Even the precise choreography of their dispersal is debated. While climate change and river shifts provide a compelling backdrop, the exact sequence of events which cities strained first, how communities coordinated their movements, or what final triggers made urban life unsustainable, is still being pieced together fragment by fragment. And while we see the cultural transmission in beads and bangles, the living, breathing moment when an Indus farmer taught a Vedic herder the name of a tree is lost to time. These are not dead ends but open invitations. The story of the Indus is not a closed book gathering dust on a shelf. It is an active excavation, and the tools of discovery are more powerful than ever. Imagine light from a laser scanner fired from an aircraft, piercing dense forest canopies to reveal the ghostly outlines of settlements buried for millennia. This technology, called Lifeblood, is revolutionizing archaeology, promising to find hundreds of unknown Indus sites, especially in the now dry riverbeds of the Gaga Hakra, potentially mapping the full extent of this civilization for the first time. In laboratories, scientists are analyzing ancient DNA from human remains, carefully extracted from teeth and bone. These genetic studies can trace population movements and mixtures with incredible precision, helping us understand who the Indus people were biologically, where their descendants went, and how they interacted with incoming groups. It is a story written in the genome. Other researchers use isotopic analysis, studying the chemical signatures locked in tooth enamel. These signatures act like a dietary passport, revealing where a person grew up and what they ate, allowing us to trace individual lifetime migrations. Was the person buried in Mohenjo-Daro born there, or had they traveled from the coast? This technique turns a single skeleton into a biography. Each of these methods offers a new lens, a new way to listen to the whispers left behind. They remind us that history is not just about what we have found, but about what we are poised to learn. The vanishing of the Indus cities is one of humanity's oldest mysteries, and we are living in the era when its deepest secrets may finally begin to speak. The true story of the Indus is not one of an ending, but of a remarkable transformation. We have walked the grid-patterned streets of a silent city and followed the echoes of its life into the vibrant world of modern South Asia. A civilization did not vanish into thin air, it simply changed its shape. It flowed from the grand, brick-built reservoirs of its cities into the deep, hidden aquifers of folk tradition, resurfacing centuries later in the shade of a sacred tree, the weight of a merchant's scale, and the familiar adornment on a woman's wrist. The lesson here is profound and humbling. The collapse of a political order, the abandonment of magnificent urban centers, does not equate to the death of a people's spirit or the erasure of their knowledge. The Indus world demonstrates that a culture's most vital elements, its practical wisdom, its symbolic language, its sense of the sacred, can possess an astonishing resilience. They travel not in royal decrees, but in the hands of potters, the songs of farmers, and the rituals of families. This endurance is the civilization's quiet, triumphant legacy. It is a testament to the power of everyday life to outlast monuments, a reminder that what we often call collapse is sometimes just a different kind of survival. So the next time you see the silhouette of a humped bull, the geometric pattern on a textile, or hear an old, untranslatable name for a local river, pause for a moment. You might be witnessing a fragment of a story 4,000 years in the telling, a single thread in an unbroken tapestry of human experience. What other ancient continuities, hidden in plain sight, surround us in our own daily lives? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to journey deeper into history's greatest mysteries with us.